We go. Program is now being recorded. So again, welcome to our Peirce Wellness Panel. Panel will focus on issues of wellness for criminal justice practitioners and the programs currently in place in Pennsylvania and around the country. As again, this program is being recorded. Attendees, please mute your microphones and leave your cameras off. That will help make sure we have sufficient bandwidth going forward and there's no issues with things breaking up and so forth. Please place any of your questions in the chat. Professors Kempf and Campbell will be monitoring the chat and present the questions during our Q&A session that's going to take place at the end of a program. Now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. First, welcome and thank you to our panelists for joining us tonight, taking time out of their busy schedules to discuss this critical issue. We do have detailed bios that we can provide for you later. Our first panelist, Dr. Christy Smith, has worked in community supervision and academia for the past 2 decades. As a probation and parole officer, she specialized in drug courts, mental health, and domestic violence. She used this practical experience, her experience as an academic, and her research skills to work in criminal justice reform and public policy for 3.5 years. She studied probation and parole officer stress and burnout for her doctoral dissertation, and she uses this information to conduct officer wellness trainings and to advocate for trauma-informed approach to the criminal justice process. She was an executive committee member of the HEAL PA Criminal Justice Action Reform Team, and she is an executive committee member on the Bucks County Reentry Coalition. Welcome, Christy. Do you have any comments?
Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to speaking with my fellow panelists on the importance of trauma-informed approaches to the criminal justice system process.
Thank you, Christy. Robert Reed is currently Director of Special Initiatives for the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Office. In this role, Rob travels the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, engaging citizens and groups on a variety of subjects of great importance. He comes with years of experience in criminal justice and law at both the federal and state levels. Welcome, Rob. Your comments to start off with.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me, and if not, you're not missing anything, but excuse me. Thanks for having me, and yeah, I haven't just spent a few years, I've spent, 45 years, so, there's a lot to talk about tonight, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you and the other panelists.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, and our final panelist, not to be the least panelist, is Dr. Ken Quick, currently an assistant professor of criminal justice at DeSales University. At DeSales, he teaches a wide variety of courses. His research focuses on multiple topics in policing, including tonight's topic, officer wellness. He has a background in law enforcement with 25 years at NYPD, retiring with the rank of inspector. Welcome, Ken. Your comments, sir.
Thank you, Frank, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. During my course at the NYPD, I held a wide variety of roles, including precinct commander, and one of my last assignments was I was top advisor to the police commissioner. But I just want to say, I'll start off like I start all my classes. I'm not here, and I haven't transitioned to academia because I believe all is well with policing. I actually think that there's a lot that needs to change with policing. I love policing. I love my time as a police officer, but I think a lot of it comes down to trauma exposure, and officer mental health. And that's a reason why we're experiencing some of the issues with public safety that we're experiencing today. So I look forward to getting into it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ken. Okay, folks, so now we're going to get started. I'm going to moderate, ask some questions. The folks are going to fill in the blanks, and wherever they are best suited to respond to the question, they will do that. So our first question is, considering trauma and wellness has become a very important topic in the field of criminal justice, and certainly both on the practitioner side and in the community. As you are all members of the HEAL PA initiative, can you talk about trauma and how it affects our CJ practitioners? Who'd like to get started?
Well, I'm happy to say a few words on this. I have been involved in HEAL PA since its initiation in 2020. And there's a nice website. Just go to healpa.org. Healpa.org, I think. I should know that. But anyway, and what we've done is we've laid out a plan for Pennsylvania to become trauma informed. And I guess we can get into the definitions. I'm not sure if anyone knows what trauma really is or what means to be trauma informed, but we can get to those definitions. But I will just say that we've been working for about 5 years. And I would say I'm very proud of the fact that one of the action teams within HEAL PA is it's really the criminal justice action team. And I work with I'm working with Christy and Ken on this in different parts of it, but we have spent a lot of time trying to identify what's the impact of trauma on people who are the providers. We'll say the police officers, correctional officers, probation officers, judges, lawyers generally, but what's also the impact on, of course, everybody we're serving. And that's, so that's just to lay the groundwork that we have spent a lot of time thinking about this, working on it. And the reality is, I would just say that trauma is a huge issue for everybody in this country, around the world, but it's particularly so within the criminal justice system.
Just to piggyback off of Rob's comments, there's been a lot of attention for the past 15 years or so about the role of adverse childhood experiences and how that may influence outcomes for individuals. Anything that they've endured as children or adults, whether it's an isolated event or it's a cumulative series of events wherein somebody has an experience that is emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, and that essentially impairs their functioning. It changes the way their brain chemistry works, it changes their worldview. And so not only are people who are coming to the attention of the criminal justice system experiencing these traumas, but the repeated exposure among criminal justice professionals of other people's trauma can then lead to vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress for the individuals that are working within the field, which is why it's so important, and why I'm so glad to see now we're at a tipping point where this has become common language, that the importance of wellness is really being spoken about in police, courts, and corrections. And that's a new theme that we're seeing. For other helping fields like psychology or sociology, even medicine, they do embed a lot of training and education into these academic curriculum that say, hey, in this field, you may experience this, and they give you the tools with which you need to be able to deal with it. Within criminal justice, that historically has not been the case. And so that's why this is such a great opportunity for people that are looking to enter or who are already in the criminal justice field to understand the role of trauma, how it impacts the individuals that are coming to the attention of the system, and how it impacts our criminal justice practitioners. I'll turn it over to you, Ken.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, it's been a pleasure that I've been able to work with Rob and Christy on this HEAL PA initiative to try to help advance the benchmarks in the state. When I was a police officer, there was some recognition of the fact that people had been previously traumatized by the police in terms of, working in an urban setting and being exposed to some hostility from the public. You kind of recognize at sort of a high level that some people have had negative experiences with the police and that you shouldn't take it personally. But where the disconnect was, I think, was in the heat of the moment, right? And the actual encounter itself, when things are growing hostile, keeping that in the right framework, right? Keeping that up front in your mind as an officer so that you could tap into that. That's something that really wasn't there. That was lost in translation, even though it was something a lot of officers would acknowledge. When the rubber meets the road, it's something that easily gets forgotten, right? So that's part of what we're trying to do with HEAL PA and the criminal justice action team is to have training that's not just a one and done, right? Because too often I've seen Christy hit the nail on the head that we're hearing a lot more dialogue about wellness, which is refreshing. We're hearing a lot of people talking about it more. But what we've yet to see is organizations really weaving it into their operational framework, right? It's a talking point. It's a annual training, but it's not something that we're thinking of and weaving it through all our decisions, how trauma impacts us, both in our dealing with the community and even in dealing with officers, right? Because I think what's so vexing about trauma is what might be traumatic for me is not necessarily traumatic for someone else. So sure, if an officer is involved in a firearms discharge, we're recognizing that that's a traumatic incident, and we're providing resources and trying to make touch points with that officer. But what about things that don't raise to that threshold but could still be traumatic, right? Which I know we're going to get into, but that's really what I think we're working for, is to try to advance this wellness talk forward to actually make it more actionable, where it's woven through all the elements of our criminal justice agencies.
Excellent. So we want to dive into this a little bit deeper with our next question, and it's a little wordy, so I'll get into it. Trauma and secondary traumatic stress can change the way the brain functions. Christy already addressed that to some degree. Impair decision-making and alter the way people interact with others, including the ways that people in the community interact with our CJ professionals and the way our CJ professionals interact with members of the community, victims, witnesses, colleagues, and people accused or convicted of violating the law. Some general signs and symptoms of trauma include, and I think Ken was alluding to some of this stuff a moment ago, anxiety, nervousness and feeling overwhelmed, irritability and moodiness, repeated and vivid memories of the traumatic event, shock, denial, or disbelief, difficulty concentrating, anger, guilt, shame, or self-blame, withdrawal from others, feeling sad, hopeless, or disconnected, and physical symptoms such as headaches, digestive issues, fatigue, racing heart, sweating, or feeling jumpy. So I think we'll go back to Ken to start this conversation. How do these signs and symptoms impact officer wellness and potentially case outcomes?
Yeah, Frank, excellent question. It's police as a subculture, as a characteristics amongst officers, right, have a tendency to grow increasingly cynical, right, as their time in police work increases, right? So that we see that cynicism starts in the academy, right? It's woven into it to be skeptical through training, skeptical of the public. And then that quickly morphs into also being skeptical of management as well, right? Where management is seen as almost like an enemy, which makes it really difficult when it comes time for addressing officer wellness and addressing trauma, because the very the very group that's supposed to be offering the help is either a tool or management themselves, right? That are trying to reach out to officers who've been indoctrinated to be cynical and distrustful of management and of agents of management, right? So that can be very problematic, right? You talked about irritability and moodiness. Well, that runs hand in hand in tandem with the cynical nature, right? That's woven into the fabric of policing. So part of what we're seeing in a trend to try to address it is really leaning into the police subculture through peer support, right? And trying to have officers trained so that they're able to help their colleagues independently and get them to a higher level of care. I conducted a study where we basically found, right, that to try to get officers to reach out for help for themselves was exceedingly difficult, right? But where we found more progress was trying to get officers to encourage others to reach out for help, right? Because it's part of that police subculture where you actually care about your colleagues and your coworkers to much of an extent more than you care about yourself, right? So peer support has some real potential in pushing that benchmark forward.
Rob, you want to dive in here? You're muted.
There I am. I'm back again.
Yeah.
So I don't know anyone other than the panelists on this Zoom. So I don't know what they know and what they don't know. So I don't know if the language we're using is challenging, or they're saying, but what is trauma? That kind of thing. So let me just say this: that you can have a bad day, and that is not necessarily trauma. But let's just say that, just to use an example, the governor had someone tried to kill him and his family yesterday. I mean, that's
Yes.
pretty clearly far beyond the typical day. That would be traumatic for him, his family, for the people who responded, maybe for the people who didn't respond on the state police side when they should have. I don't know if they should or what happened, but the bottom line is that is trauma. So trauma is really something that's very serious. It's potentially life-threatening, or at least there's a perception that it could be life-threatening. I mean, COVID really impacted everybody. And while we might not have gotten sick or very sick from COVID, we might have known someone who died or was very sick and hospitalized from COVID, that kind of thing. So that can be traumatic. And there's many types of trauma, which I'm not going to get into, but a car accident to a murder to there's lots of different types, an earthquake of, that kind of thing. And so I think it's important, though, to differentiate between a traumatic experience and PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And you can be, and depending on who you are and your resilience and, kind of your inner makeup, you may be in a serious car accident, but able to bounce back fairly quickly, where others, it might be devastating, the same kind of incident. You may be in an earthquake, and it might be really devastating to one person and not devastating at all to someone who's been through them many times. I say this because PTSD is something that really kind of kidnaps the brain and the nervous system, and it really, you go offline. Some people would say you're in a different nervous system. The normal nervous system doesn't exist anymore. And so you react to things in a very, very serious way, where you're feeling scared, you're feeling depressed, anxious, all those things we heard of before, but it may cause night sweats. It may cause nightmares. You may wake up with these horrible, screaming and, these flashbacks. Very, very serious. And it can have long-term impact on your health. That's a big thing, that if you have PTSD, it can have very serious long-term impact. ACEs that Christy spoke about are adverse childhood experiences. And again, I don't know if anyone's heard of those. There was a study in the 1990s, and essentially it said that things that happen to kids from 0 to 17 in their homes, whether it's directly to them or it's to other family members or watching other family members, that can be very, very bad for that child. And it can be both physically and emotionally bad. Abuse and neglect, as living with someone who's got mental illness or disability, not having one parent leave and that kind of thing, someone with addiction. All of these things are adverse childhood experiences. And again, the higher the exposure to ACEs, the more it can impact on your brain development, your memory, your ability to learn, and it can also impact your long-term health. And that's very serious. Trauma-informed care is really what we're hoping to get to by creating a trauma-informed Pennsylvania. It's really a way to prevent the the impact of trauma on people in our society, in our police departments, in our courtrooms, in our, whatever it is, in our educational systems. And it's a way of focusing on providing a way to look at people in a positive, humane way with empathy, recognizing that many people have had trauma and that the impact of trauma is substantial. But if we can nurture people, support people, that can make a big difference. Now, this is a very, very shortened, unfairly shortened series of explanations, but I thought that I would just say that. And I'll turn it over to Christy.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Rob. The one thing that I want to point out, Rob had mentioned about your nervous system being hijacked. And when people experience trauma, it triggers something called survival brain. So they're really operating from their most primitive fight or flight stress response whenever something like that happens. And I think we've done a really good job of pointing out acute traumas, things that, most people can recognize that might be traumatic for someone, but criminal justice professionals also experience, as do the individuals that they're working with, whether it be clients or other service providers, they also experience cumulative impacts of trauma and stress. And so significant event stress is one of them. But there are 5 other forms of stress that can lead to cumulative trauma that makes it very difficult for somebody to operate from a healthy, functioning, perspective in their nervous system. Environmental stress, for example, coming from community supervision and probation and parole, any given day can be an officer toggling between the physical environment of seeing somebody in the jail. They may also be called to court, and, depending on the judge that's assigned, depending on the cases, depending on how well the court process is going, that can also introduce some stress. So environmental stress is really important. Also, officers that are going into individuals' homes where, they may not know who else is there. It may be less of a familiar environment, can also signal some stress, and social stress. I mean, I think we'd be remiss if we, didn't address the fact that, we're in a political climate where, people believe that police and courts and corrections should be, doing one thing, whereas, there's another group of individuals that think it should be doing something different. And so being that person fulfilling that role as your job might, bring on some social stress as well. Organizational stress, there's a lot of paperwork requirements that come with these jobs. There, tend to be, and I believe Ken's going to talk to this a little bit more fully, but there are recruitment and retention issues. There are resource issues. You may be the most well-intentioned officer, whether it's law enforcement, institutional corrections, or community corrections, but if those resources are not available, or if the timeline with which they can be available is extensive, that makes it really challenging to work with and assist the people that that you're trying to help. Physiological and psychological stress. Criminal justice professionals wield an exorbitant amount of power over individuals' lives and the trajectory that those lives are going to take, which can be inherently, stressful. And also, the physical demands of the job. So all of those things kind of cumulatively can lead to some stress and trauma on all of the criminal justice professionals that are trying to work with and meet the needs of a really diverse stakeholder population, including, the policies and practices of their department, and including working with victims and witnesses, including working with clients and working with other service providers. So I think it's important to recognize that there may not be just one major significant event that results in any type of stress or traumatic experience, but that these things may build up over time, whether that time be the course of a week, a month, a year, or over the length of somebody's career.
Excellent. Thank you. So moving on from that, given the harm that trauma can impart on everyone working within and engaging with the criminal justice system, how can these trauma-informed approaches that we've kind of alluded to benefit professionals and outcomes in each of these areas? Why should we train CJ professionals and advocate for wellness and trauma-informed approaches? I don't know who's going to dive in first for that one.
Ken?
Sure. Actually, it kind of bridges to something that I sort of failed to address in my response on the last question, because you specifically referenced shame and remorse and guilt, Frank. And, I think that that's one thing that makes the criminal justice practitioner's response to trauma a little bit different, can be the shame and the remorse and guilt that kind of comes up out of it. Just as an example, on September 11th, I was actually very close to the World Trade Center, right? When the second plane hit, and then when both buildings collapsed. And for months afterwards, I experienced the after effects, but I was just filled with such shame, remorse, and guilt that so many had lost their lives. And who was I to say, hey, I'm having a tough time with this, right? So that can really affect itself in the criminal justice forum, like so many different ways, right? When an officer is killed in the line of duty, well, what about the other officers that are there, or when an officer is injured, right? And that you could carry that out in corrections, right? Whether it's community based or institutional, the same way. As an example, you talked about how do we start bridging the gap? Right. Some of my research is actually on the effect of support dogs, right? Professionally trained dogs. They're really referenced as facility dogs that agencies are starting to adopt to sort of proactively address wellness, both by reducing stress, which, ambient stress in the workplace. Dogs have been scientifically proven, right, to help address stress. It's a biophysical chemical response, right? When you interact with the dog, you release more pleasure-seeking hormones, right? But also as acting a bridge, right, between humans, right? Because of that remorse, shame, guilt, the stigma that's associated with help seeking. And we see dogs can kind of act as that bridge. So one of my last assignments in the police department, I had to respond to the hospital. A warrants officer was actually making an entry. A team of warrant officers were making an entry, and the person who they were trying to apprehend shot through a door and shot one of the officers in the leg. Ended up being fine, lived, but transported to the hospital nonetheless. And so while I was there, I noticed another detective, sort of burly, kind of coming out of one of the treatment rooms and looking over. So I went over to him. At that time, I was working in the Employee Relations Bureau, right? So we were tasked with the officer wellness. And so I asked him if everything, was all right, And he said, no, I'm fine. Just worry about, and he wanted me to worry about the officer who had been shot, right? Okay, a few minutes later, some of our caseworkers from the Employee Assistance Unit went in to speak to him. And I don't know what he said, but about 10 seconds later, they came out. Obviously, whatever he said, he wasn't really looking for assistance. Well, fast forward about an hour later, and in comes one of the NYPD's facility dogs, right? And here comes the same officer out of the room, and now he's petting the dog. So I thought I was being, very very quick-witted. I said, oh, this is Detective Jenny. She's one of our facility dogs. And so he said, well, I know this dog very well, right? She comes to our roll calls. She's around. And so you could see, he was petting the dog. Then he started talking to the employee assistance counselor. So he was able to get a little relief and a little stress and maybe make that connection to reach out in the future if needed, right? Thanks to this dog. So that's just one of the many interventions. I already mentioned peer support. It's going to take a multifaceted approach, but one of the things that I think is so important is also diving into the culture, right? And the culture, particularly, I'll speak of policing since that's my expertise. Officers are very quick to respond when an officer needs assistance, right? That's part of the culture. Hey, somebody's calling for help. We're all going to go and we're going to offer our physical assistance, and, we're going to make sure that officer's safe. We need to make sure we keep pushing so that officers recognize that backing each other up and offering that mental health assistance, right? Reaching out and saying, hey, are you okay? How you doing? I know you're going through this tough issue in your life, right? Or I know you went on that call, that had to be difficult as peer-based, right? We can steer into the police subculture, and instead of being, we're silent, we're tough, we're cops, we stand alone, it could become, yeah, we're tough because we lean on each other and we give each other support, and we're going to help somebody who needs help. And we're not going to look down on them or think any less of it. I think that's what we're missing, and that's what we need to keep pushing on.
Something else I want to point out with regard to the impact on officer wellness and the case outcomes is, as Ken had mentioned earlier, there is a tendency for people who work within the criminal justice field to become increasingly cynical through interactions that they have with the public, with the general public, with service providers, with people that are coming to the attention of the legal system, or in my area of expertise in probation and parole. Probation and parole officers are really immersed in people's lives. Having to see somebody on supervision once a month or every 2 weeks, getting to know their family, getting to know the circumstances, not only that led them to become involved in the system, but then helping them try and navigate all of the challenges that come with being under community supervision can be extraordinarily challenging and really stressful. And when, probation and parole officers and other professionals kind of adopt this worldview as a result of stress and trauma, that makes them inherently more cynical, they're less likely to trust what somebody is saying to them, it really reduces the efficacy of the interactions that they're having, which can be to the detriment and impart harm on the people they're supervising, the people they're working with, and victims or anybody else who comes in contact with them. It really does kind of limit how individuals evaluate potential outcomes. You become very myopic in, thinking things are very cut and dry and point blank, whereas they're not. And that can really limit the ability of an officer to help somebody navigate all of those challenges. It almost kind of becomes like an anchor, which makes it difficult for criminal justice professionals to work with the individuals and to improve outcomes that come along with any type of supervision or any type of interaction with the criminal justice system. So I think one of the biggest benefits of training and advocating for trauma-informed approaches is to really acknowledge that the trauma is real, not only the trauma that leads somebody to the criminal justice system, but the trauma that individuals working within the system might be experiencing, because that unaddressed trauma can lead to burnout, tardiness, absenteeism, and then other, health issues like high blood pressure, heart attacks, ulcers, and other diseases. So, I do think it's important that we lead with, how criminal justice professionals are experiencing the traumas of other individuals and the stressors associated with the job, so that they do have, overall better physical and mental health. And then, of course, when somebody is physically and psychologically more well, they tend to approach interactions and decision making and problem solving from a much better headspace that can improve outcomes for the individuals that are under supervision. You can't treat the employees of the criminal justice system like cogs in a wheel, and you can't treat the individuals that are coming to the attention of the legal system as, people on a conveyor belt that just kind of churns, people through this legal system. You really want to make sure that, we are leading with, as Ken mentioned, a culture of wellness, of recognizing the inherent stress that's associated with being involved in the legal system and the stress and trauma that is part of being a professional within this system. So I think that's why we need to advocate for this, so that organizations, employees, victims, witnesses, clients, anybody that we're working with, has a more holistic view, and, really we're all coming from a space of better decision making, wherein hopefully, this is kind of like a paradigm shift. Knowing that we've had stagnant, really high levels of recidivism, the old approach isn't working. So if we can lead with an approach that is better for all involved, then hopefully we're better able to meet the needs of the people that are coming to the attention of the legal system and the needs of the people that are working within the legal system.
So, following up on that, let me just say this, that I am, unlike Ken, a former police detective officer, and Christy, a former probation officer, I have done neither. I was a federal prosecutor for more than 30 years. So I saw my share of crime and violence, but it wasn't, when it was happening. But I did have, and I just want to say one thing, and then I want to just tell a short story. I think that one of the things that's really important, the reason, going back to the question, why officers, whether it's probation, correctional, police officers, need to understand all this, is because a lot of people think trauma is only physical trauma. They think it's getting hit, punched, shot, stabbed, all of that stuff. And the idea of you being emotionally impacted by an event is something that people don't like to admit. And so there is this stigma. And it's not just within criminal justice, it's everybody has that. And people don't like to say, I'm going to a therapist. Some a small percentage do, or say, yeah, I'm seeing my shrink today. But most people do not want to admit that. So one of the things, I actually wrote a curriculum for the Municipal Police Officers Training and Education Commission, for MOPEC to then roll it out next year on trauma-informed policing. And within that, I started it out by saying, essentially, it's about you. Trauma is about you. And it's not just the physical trauma, it's the emotional trauma. Because remember, police officers just didn't show up as a police officer when they were 21. They had a whole life before them, or 18, I should say. Whatever. They didn't just wake up and become a police officer. They had stuff happen to them in their lives. And we'll talk about that maybe when it comes to vicarious trauma. But the reality is that there have been studies that show in some departments, police officers have a higher percentage of 4 or more adverse childhood experiences than the general population. So that means that stuff has impacted them as kids. They had no idea that it impacted them, or maybe they did, but they didn't do anything about it. They didn't do anything to prevent it, or try to help themselves. And then here they're in the police department. They're dealing with all this other trauma that happens every day on the job, and they don't appreciate or understand how what may have actually happened when they were younger may impact what's going on in the police department. So it's very important to appreciate that what happens, that police need to understand there is this emotional side of trauma. It's not just the physical. The last thing I'll say is, on April 9th, which was a few days ago, it was an anniversary for me, but not a good one. I was a federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C. on April 9th. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, I had asked witnesses in my case that was going to trial to show up in my office. And one woman, her name was Carolyn Resper, wasn't there. Now, I had seen her the night before at 5:30, and so she was very reliable, didn't show up, sent detectives to her home. I get a call about 35 minutes later. I'm actually asked to go to a different office. They say, hey, Rob, Carolyn and 2 other people were found shot face down in the living room. And then a 4th person was found shot in both eyes in the bathroom. Now, yes, I was not there. I didn't see that, but I was one of the last people to see Carolyn live. So that was one of these out-of-body experiences where I went to the homicide unit in the afternoon or a couple hours later, because I was one of the last people to see her alive. And I'm sitting there, and the word is disassociating, but I'm actually thinking, I'm here talking and sounding like a lawyer. And yet there's another part of me saying, I don't want to say holy shit, but I just did. Am I next? I mean, they shot a witness, a key witness in a case. Why wouldn't they go after the prosecutor? I mean, it did cross my mind. So I say that the emotional side is very powerful, and it can last for a very long time. But I know every year on April 9th, I think of that case. It was column 1, page 1, and the Washington Post. It was not pretty, but that's something that stays with you. So I just share that with you.
Very compelling story.
I just want to follow up with something that Rob said very quickly. Rob had mentioned the presence of 4 or more adverse childhood experiences among law enforcement. And I just want to make sure that everybody's aware, the significance of that cannot be underscored, because individuals that have 4 or more ACEs are 7 times more likely to consider themselves an alcoholic. They're 10 times as likely to have injected street drugs. And this is not, again, this is not specific to law enforcement. This is for ACEs and, the outcomes, the general outcomes. They're 7 times more likely to go to prison. They're 7.5 more times more likely to experience violent victimization in adulthood. And they're 15 times more likely to attempt suicide. And the reason I point that out, and Ken can attest to this, but there are some general research findings that indicate how police in particular, how institutional corrections officers, less so is known about probation and parole officers, but that individuals within the field, partially because of the stigma, because of, the inability to be forthcoming about what they've experienced either prior to coming to the field or as a result of working in it, may self-medicate with alcohol and drugs. We have higher rates of drug and alcohol use, of divorce and suicide within individuals in the criminal justice profession. And so, I just kind of wanted to touch on that for a second. The significance of having 4 or more ACEs, either as somebody who's coming to the attention of the system as a victim, and there's also victim offender overlap, this unaddressed, unhealed trauma from a victim may then, translate into them becoming an offender or perpetrator of crime. But also this unaddressed and unhealed trauma and, lack of organizational or field awareness on the impact can have very harmful outcomes for criminal justice professionals, either because of what they experienced prior to the job or as a result of being in the field.
So you've brought some very, very important concepts to light. I'm going to go off script a little bit here, because you think about not only the ACEs that you talk about, and Rob alluded to things that happened before I became a cop. I was 24 years old when I became a cop, so I had 24 years of life, was also a volunteer firefighter and EMT, and went to some very nasty situations. So we have people who have not identified any of this stuff, who are our police officers, our probation officers, parole officers, practitioners across the field, and certainly our citizens that we're dealing with on every day, who may not have a clue as to, how does that cop showing up at your house trigger a memory from 20 years ago when something else happened and something bad happened to your family and the police were involved. All these things, and certainly for officers, how does me being involved in a certain situation remind me of something that happened in my childhood? Very important stuff, which leads us, I think, very nicely into the next segment, is since we have discussed the personal, professional, and practical ways that being trauma-informed benefits the individuals, organizations, and people experiencing involvement with the system, and this includes all people, why is it such a challenge to implement trauma and wellness training into academies and emphasize them in annual updates? I know, and it's been mentioned several times, I think, Christy, you mentioned in your opening that it's been more focused on the last 15 years or so. I mentioned earlier, just finding out recently that the peer support program is growing in New Jersey, where I was a police officer. Just teams just created in Camden County, New Jersey, and Burlington County, New Jersey, including several officers from the department I used to work with. And I'm really happy to hear that. They also have that resiliency officer program in New Jersey. But what can we talk about that challenge? And also, I think it's a good time to address what are we doing for these officers? What kind of programs? I alluded to a couple of them. Can you folks all expand on that as well?
Sure, I'll start off. You know, you would said why, right? Why is it so difficult? Why hasn't it taken root? Um, you know, back when COVID struck, something happened that I never thought I would see the NYPD ever do, right? It actually, as once, started getting a handle on COVID and about the fact that some people were more vulnerable to it than others, right? People who had, let's say, diabetes, right? Overweight. So the NYPD started a program. I never would have thought I would have seen this in my lifetime, right? But they started a program where officers could voluntarily self-report this information, right? Come forward to the department. So basically, voluntarily give up their HIPAA rights and inform the department of their conditions. And they were allowed to work from home, right? In their capacity, right? Assisting public safety. Obviously, you can't go out on patrol from home, but they were given assignments that they could do from home. And again, I thought, how great is this? This is so forward thinking that the NYPD would be so committed to wellness. And then George Floyd happened. And they needed to get a lot of George Floyd was murdered, right, in Minnesota. And the protests started happening. NYPD, New York City, tumultuous, right? Always at the forefront of protests for any events that happen around the world. And they needed to get officers out on the street very quickly and very expeditiously. So what did they do? They ordered the same group of officers that was allowed to stay home because they have vulnerable medical conditions. They had to come back to work by the next day. And instead of putting them back in their usual assignments, they created a task force where these officers could go out and work the demonstrations and be on the front line and be more susceptible to COVID. So what happened, right? Well, I mean, we could say that it was very poor organizational planning and poor choice, but this situation changed everything. And my point of sharing this story is I think that's what happens a lot in public safety. That's what happens a lot in policing. So most people will agree wellness is important. The wellness of our people is the most important for a short period of time. And then something will happen that diverts us that we say, no, we have to do this. So I've always said wellness is either everything or it's nothing. That's why I started out when you asked, I said, we talk about it more. It is in the curriculum. You won't find a very few and far between police academies in this country don't address some sort of wellness in their curriculum, right? But officers quickly realize when they graduate and they go to their department, wellness is good, but this is more important, right? Right now, the NYPD, Christy alluded to it, I should say law enforcement, policing across the country is having a really hard time retaining officers, and they're having a hard time recruiting new officers. And a lot of that has to do with work-life balance, because as the workforce shrinks and as more officers leave the occupation, officers that remain are being worked more and more days off canceled, more shifts prolonged, more ordered in overtime, right? And it all comes at the cost of officer mental health. And we don't have metrics that say this officer has worked too long. They have to be given some time off no matter what, right? And our young people are seeing this. They're seeing that cost being paid. And a lot of them are saying, why should I do that? I always ask my students, what, if they're interested in policing, if they like police, if they don't, why not? And what I found by and large is young people are not going into policing because they dislike the police or they don't support them. They're not going into policing because they're saying, I don't want to do that to myself. I don't want to do that to my mental health. I don't want to give up, my private life, my things I enjoy, and they shouldn't have to. So I think that has to do with why it's not being addressed, Frank.
Can I just chime in on that? There's also what's interesting is that, look, being a police officer is dangerous. I mean, I'm not a police officer, never been, but it is a very dangerous job, physically, and also emotionally. But I remember traveling to Erie, Pennsylvania. For some reason in 2019, I had to drive across Pennsylvania. I live in Montgomery County, back and forth and back and forth. And it seemed like every time I drove there was another suicide in the New York City Police Department. There were 10 suicides that year. And I remember reading about it because I was speaking to the Erie Police Department in part. That was one of the things I was going there about, the very thing we're talking about today. And, the commissioner at that time was James O'Neill. And I remember he said, this was back then, and I'm just quoting, "We're mourning the death of two members of our NYPD family this week, both of whom died by suicide in separate incidents less than 24 hours apart. Whether you're depressed, going through a separation, having financial difficulties, feeling anxiety, or anything else, you are never alone. Nothing is ever hopeless. We cannot hide from this incredibly important discussion. We must not pretend that these things don't happen or that such tragic deaths are somehow a fact of life." And, the bottom line is, he goes on, and it's incredibly sad. Any person who dies by suicide, it's so horrible for the family and, to deal with, but it's also horrible for the colleagues of someone who dies by suicide. But, the reality is that it's just taken a long time, in my view, too long, for people in the criminal justice universe, that goes to also corrections and probation, to recognize that suicide is a reality. And yes, there are completed, that is, people die by suicide, and people within law enforcement are 50% more likely to die by suicide than the general population. But, people attempt suicide, and they put guns, and they're talked kind of down or out of it, or they decide themselves. But the point is that it's a real thing because of all the stuff they've done. And then I might say the reality is that officers die in the act of performing their jobs. And I've gone to, and probably not nearly as many as you, but in Philadelphia in 2007 through 9, we lost about 9 officers. And I went to all their funerals, and I was there for seeing, these young families, many of them young families, and the kids walking up to the open casket in a large cathedral. And it was crushing. It was so sad. So, I mean, I think that people, unfortunately, for too long, I think now that people are starting to get it, but all of that has an impact. And any death has an impact on people around the person who died. But the reality is that it's taken the people in criminal justice, I think, a very long time to recognize that this has a real impact on the way people function, the way people live, and that's something that they need to take more seriously. Fortunately, I am seeing a shift in this, and I think it's conversations like this and many other presentations that are going to make a difference. But I do think that it's been a long time in coming, that the trauma that officers experience has really gone unrecognized, ignored, almost belittled, for so long.
You teed me up nicely, Rob, because I think there are 3 primary challenges that are common among police, courts, and corrections as we kind of divvy up the systems processing. And, you'd mentioned like the stigma and ignoring it. I think one of the top reasons why it makes it difficult for organizations and their leadership and their staff to buy into this is that, acknowledging that something may have been traumatic is often perceived as a weakness. And so, within the law enforcement, within institutional corrections, I think those cultures, those organizational cultures are a little bit more rigid than what they are in probation or parole. But, the perceived response that they may get from another peer, a staff member, colleague, leadership, and acknowledging that something happened to them that was traumatic, and having that be looked at as maybe a weakness, is really a challenge. As is the potential for an officer to lose their firearm or to have their role changed, because they're curious, and staff and leadership are worried about how is this going to impact their ability to do their job, and also a hesitancy or a reluctance of somebody to come forward and acknowledge or seek resources or talk about something that might have been traumatic, because they fear loss of advancement opportunities, or retaliation within the job. So from an employee perspective, I think those are kind of the big three barriers that make it challenging. But you also have to look at, and this is Pennsylvania specific. This is also community supervision specific. In Pennsylvania, 86% of the Commonwealth's number of people that are on adult supervision, they're supervised at the county level. So in Pennsylvania, we have county, state, and federal community supervision, depending on, obviously, where the law was violated and what jurisdiction it comes under. But 86% of these individuals are being supervised at the county level. And we have 67 different counties in Pennsylvania that are doing 67 different things. There are some kind of minimal, training standards that have only recently been put into place. But these organizations use different risk and needs assessment. They have different models for reentry. They have different processes for various transition points. And there's also kind of a hesitancy or a fear to kind of really dive on into this, because we don't want this to just be a flash in a pan, or like, is this the newest shiny object that we have to focus on? This really does need to be something that is part of orientation and onboarding, and that is part of regular annual training updates, so that we can make sure that this is something that is sustained, and that it does produce organizational cultural change. But one of the biggest issues is that funding may be lacking for organizations, so they may want to have trauma-informed practices. They may want to have wellness and resilience officers. They may want to do these things for their department. But if they're lacking funding, or if there's there's no legislation that's mandating this, then that's going to be really difficult for these organizations to either implement or for them to sustain. So I think that's really kind of what makes it really challenging, is that our systems, the policies and practices, the ways that training is mandated, and the way that things like this are funded, it's just so different that it does make it challenging to get everybody on board. It not only recognizing the importance of this, but also putting those resources into place so that everybody has the opportunity to benefit from them.
Fabulous. So I do want to expand a little bit. I asked a little about it. If you could address, what are some of the existing programs for practitioners in Pennsylvania and surrounding states? I, again, alluded to some of them, but we do have practitioners or people who are planning to become practitioners on the call. So what should they be looking for as to what's available for them?
Just thinking.
I think what Christy had said, Frank, really kind of hit the nail on the head when we're talking about Pennsylvania, right? Part of Pennsylvania is a commonwealth, right? So the emphasis is really on local control, which is nice in a way because it makes sure that local government is closer to the problems, can be at can be a little bit more responsive. But one of the downsides of that as Christy said, was you have all these different entities working, right? So Rob can attest with our work with Heal PA, that's probably one of the most vexing challenges is trying to get everyone, I'll say Commonwealth, right? Because I moved from New York to Pennsylvania, so I can't say state, right? The Commonwealth, to try to keep everybody on the same page is really challenging, as opposed to New York or New Jersey, where you have the attorney generals, the chief law enforcement officer, but they have the edict power to, with what strike of 110
Exactly.
to changes. We have been trying to work with local, not local, I'm sorry, with some of the state legislators, right, Rob, to try to get some emphasis, some momentum going. But particularly, Frank, the thing is, as I said, the education is offered there. There's a lot of onus on individuals to taking responsibility for themselves, right? And that's why to anybody in this forum who's thinking about going into public safety or the criminal justice system, I applaud you. You will not have any more rewarding career of being able to help others, right? And make a tangible footprint and to lead a life of significance. But make sure you have a plan for your own mental health and wellness, right? Because at the end of the day, we're responsible for ourselves. So there's a lot of self-care, right? There's a lot of mental health. And I pray one day as a system, we're going to get together and we're going to do it for everyone collectively. But in the meantime, I would say self-care is just that. We need to have our own plans, but don't let it keep you from criminal justice, because if you maintain that positive mental health outlook and that self-care, can have a great, fruitful, productive career.
So,
Then,
oh,
you want to go ahead, Rob?
all right. Well, I'll just very briefly say, so in the short term, beginning in 2026, all 21,000 people in law enforcement are going to receive training in trauma. So that's a beginning, and that's going to be across the board. And again, how many people are going to really get it? I don't know. It can't be just a one-off and then people say, okay, another training, got that out of the way. Now I do, this training and that training. And, the bottom line is there's also a program called Handle with Care, which has been implemented across Pennsylvania in a number of different communities, but yet I would like to see legislation that all communities have Handle with Care. Essentially, what it means is police or EMS or probation, anybody coming across a child in dire circumstances, where again the prototype might be police are called for a domestic abuse incident in a home. They go to the home, they knock on the door, they see Johnny, Susie, and Larry. They're 5, 7, and 9, and they're all watching their mom get pummeled by their dad. That's trauma. That is huge trauma. And then they see their dad carted off in handcuffs to the police station. The bottom line is that's bad for the child, but what the police can do, EMS, probation, anyone seeing that child, in Handle with Care, you notify the school district. And this is all orchestrated. It's all through training and presentations, and the contacts are all well known within the department, the police department, as well as the school district. And they notify the school district that Johnny, Susie, and Larry have had something happen and they need to be handled with care. And this is a way so when they go to school the next day or the next few days, the school is on notice that something happened. So that's a small training. Yale, up in New Haven, they do a lot of work on domestic. How do police officers respond to domestic incidents, domestic violence incidents? And there are now lots of trainings, or not lots of, but there are trainings on how to deal with children at different ages. really toddler to 5 years old, 5 to 12, and then 12 to 17, that kind of thing. How do you interact with that child? So there are trainings out there. I think the resilient officer training that was done in New Jersey, which I attended, is excellent, and that would be a great follow-up to what we're doing here through MOPEC. So those are some things that I'm hoping that eventually everyone will get, but because of this issue of living in a commonwealth, it's really hard to get everyone on the same page.
With regard to promising programs in probation, parole, and community supervision, Chester County Adult Probation and Parole, and now Pretrial Services, which is one of the departments I originally worked for, around 2015 or 16, they established the WRAP program, which is a gender responsive program. WRAP stands for Women's Reentry Assessment and Programming. And this really acknowledges the disproportionately higher rates of physical, sexual, financial, psychological trauma that women coming to the attention of the criminal justice system have endured. And it really was built off of, the knowledge that we got from the ACEs study from 1995. So having a gender responsive program that includes gender specific risk and needs assessment, and gender-specific and trauma-informed supervision and programming was put into place to reduce recidivism, decrease the technical violations of community supervision, and increase the overall health and well-being of justice-involved women, their families, and the communities. And then building off of this work, around 2017, 2018, Lancaster County Adult Probation and Parole Department was one of the first departments to kind of lead with a whole department approach to being trauma informed. Within the first year, the department struggled because they led with the impact of ACEs on the clients that were being supervised. And the staff and rank and file said, what about me? What about me? Like, what about my trauma needs? What about my stress? And so they kind of rebuilt their entire their core values for the entire adult probation and parole department around being trauma informed and recognizing the impact of trauma on individuals and their communities. And some of the other core values include treating people with dignity and respect, believing that people can make positive changes, and believing in the balance of rehabilitation with enforcement, so that that's specifically tailored to each individual. York County also has a trauma-informed care action plan, that has been really impactful. And there are a number of different SAMHSA provided train the trainer opportunities that are available, so that any of these probation and parole officers can be trained as a trauma trainer and then bring that information back to their departments on an ongoing basis. Just some national efforts. There are some resources from the Justice Clearinghouse about the changing face of probation and how to shift into a trauma-informed agency. There are also some from the American Probation and Parole Association, some panel discussions about how this is an essential practice that needs to be used so that we can transform how we think about the work that we're doing, and so that we can be more effective in community corrections. And then there are also a number of resources that are available from the National Institute of Corrections on trauma-informed care and trauma-specific services, which is a really comprehensive guide that offers resources to individuals that are working within the system, not only for their own self-care, as Ken mentioned, which is critical, but also how, the primary goal of this is to, it's safe to assume that, based off of all the available statistics, that 100% of people that are coming into contact with the system have some sort of history of trauma. And so we all want to be taking those universal precautions so that we are not re-traumatizing or re-triggering trauma in individuals that we're coming into contact with, regardless of, who that individual is, a colleague, somebody that's under supervision, a victim, a witness, somebody in the community. So, as we said earlier on, there has been kind of this paradigm shift where we're acknowledging the significance and the importance of this, and now we're kind of building this robust body of resources and research to support these efforts. But, as Rob mentioned earlier, some of these things are also available on the healpa.org website, as are resources for resilience as well.
Can I
Great,
just say
great
one more?
comments.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go.
I'm just going to say just a couple of things. One is there is also a website. It's called the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit. It's this was something that actually a person I know actually helped put it together. Essentially, it provides, again, all sorts of resources, but this is something you can learn about what vicarious trauma is. It's not your trauma, it's actually the impact someone else's trauma has on you. So it might be your wife hearing about something bad that happened to you as an officer at work. She may actually have vicarious trauma. Or you hear another officer in another department was killed, but and that officer, you feel real pain, so the bottom line is there's a lot of information there, Vicarious Trauma Toolkit. I just also want to say just one thing though before we, and I just feel it's really important that one of the reasons that it's so important, in my view, for officers to learn about this is because it humanizes the officer. They're no longer machines. They're no longer this robot, this military warrior. They are a human being. Before underlying all of that, they are a human being. And once they can understand that they may have been hurt by things that happened, or other people in their department have been hurt by things that have happened, and that's impacted the way they live their life, or they do whatever they do, or it impacts their family's life, they're going to be more apt to be empathic towards the people they serve. And I think that's really, really important. So there's so much to say on that, but I do think that we have to humanize the community, because I know that we tend to, it's this us and them, police on one side and then the community on the other. And that is not a healthy thing. I understand why it's happened, but I think that part of it's happened. One of the reasons it's happened is because we tend to other that group. And so the people who see a police shooting of a civilian say, oh, they are all horrible, they're murderers. And people going into an area in wherever it is, and they say, this is a dangerous area. These people are not human. And they literally don't see each other as human beings. We've got to change that and understand that so many people in our communities have been impacted by trauma, as not just the police, but the community as well. And it's something that will, I think when people have this understanding, it will enable the police to better understand what's happening.
All right, excellent. We are coming very close to the end of our program, so I'm going to move to my colleagues, Professor Kemp and Campbell, to see what's going on in the chat, to see if any folks have any burning questions for you. And I will just throw this out there to what Rob just said about the police and the community. Remember some guy named Sir Robert Vincent Peale a long, long time ago said the police are the community and the community are the police. And I think we definitely need to remember that. All right, hand off to Professor Kemp.
Hi, first of all, thank you guys so much. This has been so wonderful and so informative. I know I'm seeing a lot on the chat too of people just really learning so much. So thank you for your time. We have a few questions. The first one is, where can a female officer who's being abused by their spouse and the father of her children turn to when the abuser is also a police officer of higher rank? They also mentioned that Laurel House is overwhelmed and that somebody on the force will not go there, but.
I guess I'll take a stab at that first, since it's a policing question. I can speak, for the NYPD, since that's where my experience was, I would assume that most large police departments are the same in that they have robust programs, they really do, for domestic violence, and they have internal affairs as well. The problem is whether or not officers feel comfortable using those resources, right? Because not only might you have legitimate concerns about your safety, your career, right? But with any domestic violence, right? Whether it's police officer involved or just any civilian involved in domestic violence, your feelings for this other person likely have not just disappeared, right? So for police officers in particular, if you're seeking help, you know that the person, your abuser, right, stands at risk to get punished really by the police department and have their career jeopardized and have their livelihood jeopardized, which you might also be dependent on financially, right, emotionally, psychologically for support. So it is a problem. Now, I do think that the police department would respond if they were aware of it so that the actual physical abuse might be rectified, at least certainly temporarily, right? But the long-lasting effects could be detrimental, right? And I think smaller police departments, it's even more challenging for officers who work there. I really do. Because so I think that this is part of the fact that police officers are human. So they have the same problems as the general population. Maybe some things as like Christy was saying, you know, with self-medication and self-soothing, maybe even some more exposure and potential for domestic violence. So to answer the question, are the resources there? Yes. But are there real reasons that inhibit police from coming forward and using them? Yes, there are. That's why we have a lot of work to still do.
Thank you so much. The next question we have is obviously supporting those suffering with PTSD is huge. Is there any work with moral injury or spiritual care for those suffering as well, you know, and those who are caring for them? The whole mind, body, spirit approach.
Well, I would just say generally, yes, there is. I mean, there are many types of trauma and trauma treatment, but trauma treatment will take into consideration the impact on, you know, the spiritual harm it's caused and the moral harm it's done. But, you know, the reality is that you need to find a trauma-informed person and program that will, you know, have an understanding of that, and they exist. I mean, I can't give you 5 names right now off the top of my head, but the bottom line is they exist. You know, the whole trauma thing is about 30 years old. So this is an exploding field, and given everything that's going on in our country right now, it's going to explode that much further exponentially. But, you know, so there's not as many trained people as we need to have. A lot of our medical schools know nothing about trauma. That is trauma, what it means to be trauma informed. And I know that because I actually taught a class at Temple University Medical School and taught doctors. So the reality is that there's a lot of work to do on expanding trauma informed care and the kinds of programs, but there's many programs out there to deal with just that.
Thank you. And the last one, I'm going to give it a shot. I'm not entirely sure. So maybe somebody else can take a look at the question in the chat. But it says, how can trauma-informed practices start at onboarding and become enmeshed in an organization rather than being put in its own separate training category? Does that make sense?
Well, I would just respond this way to after George Floyd was murdered, we came together in the AG's office and we said, what can we do? And I was kind of the reform guy. And so I said, why don't you have everyone receive training in what it means to be trauma-informed and trauma-informed policing? And then lo and behold, the legislature passed it. It became law. And so I called up MOPEC and I said, I'm here. I work in this stuff. I'm happy to help you. It's 5.5 years later that it's really being rolled out. Now, I consider that kind of a victory. But on the other hand, it's like, are you kidding me? And I know this is being recorded, but the bottom line is that why wasn't it done in 2021? And there's lots of reasons why, maybe, and practical reasons. But so just to get that kind of groundwork laid, so then to get, and I know that there have been some presentations to cadets, but to embed that in cadet training is going to be another step. And, so it's just going to take time, sadly.
And if I could just add to what Rob just said too, that's what I've been talking about almost this whole time, right? Like we're there with some of the training, right? Like Rob said, we're expanding the statewide training, but training as a one-off can only be so effective. When I personally really seen the magic happen is when the leadership of an agency takes this and it becomes part of who they are. When the leader really endorses it. We have several chiefs on our committee, right, for HEAL PA, that are just, they're walking the walk and they're talking the talk, right? And they have the positions of authority and they're being good examples for their people. And I think that's growing too. Right. So like Rob said, it's taking a while, but we are moving. We are moving that big boulder, right? Just not quite as fast as we want to, but we're going to keep chipping away at it. And man, maybe we have some future criminal justice leaders sitting on this call that are going to hear something and they're going to take to it and they're going to become leaders out there and they're going to join us and help keep pushing it forward too.
Yeah, and if I could just add, and Christy said this as well, a friend of mine, her name is Sandy Bloom, and she's very well known for creating something called the sanctuary model of trauma-informed practice. But the reality is that helping individuals is incredibly important. Helping each officer, anyone learn about trauma is really important. But the change will not happen unless the systems change, because the systems and the departments themselves can be just as traumatizing as individuals. And so we have to shift in the way we do the leadership and the leaders. That's why sometimes leaders will say, oh, everyone needs to go to the training, but I'm going to go off and play golf with my buddies. No, it's most important for the chief, because the chief can hopefully require the continued education of people within the department.
That's it for the chat. Thank you guys so much. And I think we just made the time too.
All right. Thank you, Professor Kemp, for taking care of that. So I probably have a million questions, but we don't have the time. So I want to throw back to our panelists to see if you have any closing comments to put a topping on this whole thing.
I'll start off. I did put my contact information in the chat, so if there are additional questions, please never hesitate to reach out. But as Ken mentioned, our own health and wellness is also our responsibility. There are so many things that you can do at home. There are so many things you can do at work. There are so many things that you can put into place that are specific to you and how you navigate stress. And so as you're either involved in the criminal justice field already, or as you're considering your career options, I would just strongly encourage everyone to just think of the top 3 things that they can do on a consistent and regular basis to maintain, reduce levels of stress and to maintain their own wellness. And also having a great therapist and some other daily, practices like meditation and, gratitude. Those things can go a long way. So I would just start with that.
And I'll let Rob go last because
Okay.
he's such a great orator.
Blah, blah, blah.
I'll let him be the last thing they'll remember, so I'll go in between. I just really wanted to thank everybody for being here and thank the fellow panelists and Frank. It's always great to work with such a dynamic team. And just to echo Christy, I think self-care is so important. And I hate when I hear young people or young professionals say about mental health and policing and how it's detrimental. It can be, but you'll also see some of the best things and get exposed to things that other people do not, right? And you can be that positive change. What we need to learn how to do, and some of it is on each of us to do individually, though, is to really synthesize those great experiences and capture them and wrap them up and put them in your pocket and bring them with you through those bad experiences to carry you through. Because I mean, I don't regret my time, in public safety. In fact, I miss it. And one of the things I like is just being able to have a role and shape people moving forward. So please don't let anything discourage you from going forward and unfortunately exposing yourself to trauma, because trauma, when we process it properly, gives us post-traumatic growth, which really can be issues that will help us live more fulfilling, more vital lives. And that's your topic for your next roundtable, Frank, post-traumatic growth. All right, thank you.
Well,
Yes, I love that term when I heard it the other night. That is awesome.
can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, well, in terms of self-care, I'm going to have a glass of wine and ice cream right now. But and I think it's very important. I think that being too finicky when it comes to diet is overrated. But I will just say this, that another subject for another one of these events is, in the course of the next week and a half, we're going to do 6 presentations for people around Pennsylvania on trauma, reentry, and resilience. What does that mean? Reentry, people coming out of jails and prisons and coming home. So I say that because 100% of the people who go to prison in not just Pennsylvania, anywhere, they have been impacted by trauma, and a very high percentage have PTSD, and their percentages of suicide are through the roof. No wonder, and almost 60-70% have some mental illness or drug abuse. No wonder there's recidivism. So the bottom line is that the training that we're talking about for police, whether it's corrections, police officers, probation officers, is that you can better understand the people who are coming into the system. You may even before they're in the system, you see them on the street. The bottom line is that so many people have been impacted by trauma, and through our humanity, through our decency, through our kindness, through our empathy, we can actually make a difference in people's lives. So we don't have these just horrific numbers that we see in our criminal justice system.
Great, great. Thank you so much. So first of all, I want to thank the panelists. Ken, Christy, Rob, thank you for taking the time to come and join us here at Peirce. I want to thank my colleagues, Ivy and Chris, for working behind the scenes and monitoring that chat, and thank all the attendees who came here to learn about this extremely important topic. What I do want to let all of my students know is this will be available in your individual courses in Canvas, and ultimately for everyone, hopefully on the Peirce College YouTube channel at some point. Thank you again and have a wonderful evening. I'm going to turn off the recording at this time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Be well.